talk about NABOR contracts today. In case you didn't know, my name is Sam Saad, and I am a real estate attorney here in Southwest Florida. I have offices throughout Southwest Florida, and I'm looking forward to working with everybody here, teaching you these NABOR calls. I will tell you, first off, I'm an attorney, so there's a disclaimer. Everything I give you is good advice, but it's not legal advice. A little bit about our firm. I've been doing this now for quite a while, 13, 14, no. I started the firm 13 years ago, but I've been a lawyer for 16 years, and we handle real estate and business law. As far as what I want you to focus on in this slide, I am actually on the Legal Resources Committee for NABOR, and I'm actually the scribe of the Legal Resources Committee, which means when you say who writes this stuff, when you read the contract, I'm the guy that actually writes the contract. So that's out there. Today, we are going to talk about the contract. We'll talk about the as-is, the vacant land contracts. And as we go through, we'll talk about some of the addenda and amendments. NABOR provides 80 forms. It's very, very comprehensive. So there's probably nothing that you haven't thought of that you don't need, that we haven't provided an amendment or an addendum for. So always look through those forms in your form simplicity or your zip forms. And if you can't find anything, then we can talk about that further too. Okay, so let's dive right into the contract. First up, buyer and seller. So obviously you're going to know who your buyer is because you're going to take them out, you're going to show them property and things like that. And then you're going to want to make an offer. And the question is, who is actually the seller? So you got to go to LIPA to call your appraiser and find out who is on the last recorded deed. Now, the last recorded deed may actually be a quitclaim deed. It may be a tax title. It may be a PR deed from a personal representative. It may be some other court order related to a divorce. But you got to get the right seller on the contract. And there's probably, in many cases, more than one seller. And it's very important that you bind the right parties. The last thing you want to do is go into contract, get the deposit, spend some money, do the inspections, get the appraisal, and then find out that you don't have all the sellers on your contract, and then the ex-wife doesn't want to sign. So be very careful. It's very important to have your seller. The other thing I want to talk about on this very first top of the contract is addresses. You gotta have contact information for your buyer and seller for purposes of legal notice. I can't tell you how many contracts come in that don't have the right address, and I got to send the attorney letter, and I'm asking the agent, well, where the heck do I send my letter when I have no address? So be very, very cautious there about that. Okay, so let's talk about the next part of the contract. What are you selling? The NABOR contract is very different from the FARBAR contract in terms of what's comprehensively listed on the first page. You obviously you need the address, the legal description, and the appurtenances, which would be the garage, the cabana, the storage locker. And can everybody see the contract? You have to unmute yourself. Just shake your heads. Can you see the contract on my screen? Yes?
No.
All we can see is the "What are you selling" slide.
Shoot. Okay, I don't know how to do that.
So yeah, so if you stop screen share and then go back to screen share and share your whole screen, it'll show you going back and forth between them.
All right, I will just describe it, and if people have questions about the contract, I will happily take questions during this presentation or afterwards with regard to the specific to the form. But okay, so the list of items that the NABOR contract has is much more comprehensive than the FARBAR. The one thing I want to point out, washer and dryers can day. So if you have the buyer and you have promised a washer and dryer and you're used to the FARBAR contract, make sure you write washer and dryer into your FARBAR. If you have the seller and you're used to the FARBAR contract and somebody brings you a NABOR contract, make sure your seller knows that they're going to lose their washer and dryer. Happens a lot. I know a lot of realtors that have bought washers and dryers over the years, so I point that Similar to the FAR-bar, the NABOR deems the personal property of no value. So you want to make sure that if you have a lender involved and they're questioning personal property is going to transfer, you can point out to them on the contract. It's actually listed right on there on lines 17 and 18 of the contract, right up front, of no value. So anything that's transferring, if it's going to transfer with value, you'll do a separate personal property agreement that your lender doesn't see because it's outside that the real estate transaction. And as the realtor, you really shouldn't be involved too much in the personal property transaction, because as a realtor, you're a licensed seller. You actually subject your seller to 5.7% sales tax, no, 6% sales tax on those items. So have your lawyer or your closing agent do the personal property transfer agreement. Okay, moving right along. So then you've got to put the purchase price in. On the NABOR form, you put your purchase price on top, just like FAR-bar, and then you have your initial deposit to be held in escrow, and then you pick a company's due on the effective date, due not later than, and then fill in however many days after the effective date. I will say 3 days after the effective date and use a wire is always the preference. 2 days, 3 days after the effective date with a wire. So, and you do 1, 2, or 3 days after the effective date, because you got to get the contract signed by both parties. You got to get it to me. I got to get my wire instructions to the buyer. The buyer's got to initiate their wire, which means they may have to make an appointment with their lender. With their financial institution because of COVID. So that I typically say check box, the third box. Can you see my pointer? Check this box, and oops. And do 3 days so that the escrow officer can get the instructions, the wire instructions out. Okay, line 34, proceeds of mortgage, see paragraph 4B. I cannot stress in your financed deals how important it is to put a dollar amount in this box right here. On your FAR-bar forms, let me see if I can mute. Here it is. On your FAR-bar forms, you can put a percentage. On the NABOR forms, they reference dollars, and the dollar amounts calculate in the zip forms and the form simplicities. And of course, if you're doing a seller mortgage, you put that here, and then the balance auto-populates here in your standard form, in your standard forms. Again, places for 2 deposits, so you can do 2 deposits if you want to. Typically, I'm looking for 5 to 10%, but I know that's a little high for most people. But that's really how you secure the contract. Okay. Next up in the NABOR form is the offer counteroffer. So you enter the revocation date. I will tell you right now, it is absolutely malpractice to not fill in the revocation date. If you do not put your date to end the offer, and you leave an open-ended offer, and somebody comes back like 3 weeks later and says, yeah, I'll take that offer, malpractice. Your buyer's going to be on the hook. They're going to be in contract, and there's going to be a problem. The only saving grace that's different from the FAR-bar form and the NABOR form, the buyer is liability is limited to deposits made, not owed, made. And that deposits made is very important. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But that'll save your buyer in the event that you make the mistake of making an open-ended offer, but you shouldn't do that. Okay, so there's a standard 2 days for counteroffers unless you otherwise stated. There's a blank on line 43. And then the effective date is the last day signed or initialed by either party. And I want to make sure you know this. FAR-bar requires delivery. So if your buyer makes an offer Monday morning, your seller signs Monday night, but you don't get the offer back to the buyer until Tuesday, on the FAR-bar, the effective date is Tuesday. On the NABOR, the effective date is Monday. very important when you're doing inspections on a short delivery that you don't miss a day by not delivering the contract to the buyer, back to the buyer. Very, very important. You still have a delivery requirement though. It's just that's where the effective date changes. Oops. Okay. So closing occurs on the date stated in the contract. This is true to FAR/BAR, this is true to NABOR. When you write in on or before, both parties have to agree on the new date. Just because you write on or before the 31st of July does not mean that the buyer gets to walk into the closing office on the 14th, pound the desk, and demand a closing. The seller has to agree. So this on or before thing that I see in all these contracts, I can tell you it's meaningless. Okay, now major, huge difference between FAR/BAR and NABOR contract. Time is of the essence for closing only in the NABOR contract. So if your buyer is late on their deposit or your something like that, the seller's remedy is not to terminate. The seller has to put the buyer in breach and then give an opportunity to cure. There has to be a reasonable amount of time to cure. So for example, buyer misses the second deposit date, 15 days typically for the second deposit, 16th day, the deposit's not in. Seller's remedy is to send the buyer a letter at that legal notice address from page 1 of the contract and say, hey, buyer, you're in breach of contract. You have 1 business day to make your second deposit. And that's what you do. Then if they miss that second, that day, then you can terminate and keep the first deposit. So that's a major difference from FAR/BAR, because FAR/BAR, time is of the essence for each and every date. And if you miss any date, even by a minute, then technically the contract terminates and the seller gets the deposit. Okay, so the other thing about the NABOR contract that's different from the FAR/BAR is the buyer selects the closing agent. Even in Lee County, where the seller pays title, and we'll talk about that, the buyer picks the title agent. So, because the buyer's lender. So when you're filling out your contract, and you'll notice in the NABOR form that the escrow agent information goes to the very end. It's not in the deposit section on page 1. It's at the very end of the contract, at the bottom of the last page. The buyer picks that, then they make their offer, then the seller still has to pay for it in Lee County. So there's going to be some negotiation and some discussion about attorney's fees and closing fees between the seller and the buyer up front as part of the offer process. And of course, we always have the lowest fees, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, then now this is similar to the NABOR, to the FAR/BAR. The NABOR says leave the property in broom clean condition and the entire property free of debris. Now, I don't know how many of you have done a vacant land contract. I have done it where the property was not left free of debris because at the walkthrough, the buyer discovered that the seller's neighbor had been dumping concrete on the back of the vacant land. Well, that's not free of debris. So we had a last minute hurrah and an escrow while the seller removed a bunch of concrete from the back of his property. So be careful about that. Walk your property, know your property, and then when you do the walkthrough, make sure it's broom clean and free of debris. Okay, so the financing in the NABOR contract couldn't be more different than financing in the FAR/BAR. So obviously, if it's a cash deal, you may get financing, but there's no Consumer Financial Protection Bureau protections in the contract, which means there's no 10-day window, is really what that means. Now, if you're getting a loan, you got to fill in the contract. There's no default rate in the NABOR form for interest. So you've got to fill that in. If you are getting a VA or an FHA loan, excuse me, there is another VA FHA rider addendum that you have to fill out. It's called the amendatory clause, and it's got to be signed by both parties and made a part of the contract. Now, I'm going to go through this in some detail. I wish I could show you this contract. How do I show the contract? I just stop screen share and start again?
Yeah, do a stop screen share. When you go to share again, it'll ask you what you want to share. You should be able to see the contract. And I'm going to go ahead and attach it in the chat as well so people can follow along.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Do that. Can you see the contract? Everyone's shaking their heads. Good. Okay. So, let me get my little pointer up again. Okay. So you check financing contingency. You pick in here whether you want a conventional, VA, FHA, or other. I've actually never seen other, but that's okay. You pick that you want a fixed rate of interest because nobody really does variable rate loans right now. Then you pick 30 years for your term, unless you're doing a 15-year. Then this blank right here, you want to put in how long the buyer has to get the loan applied for, and then the buyer shall make a continuing good faith and diligent effort to obtain the loan and comply with all applicable requirements of the creditor, lender, and CFPB rule relating to the loan process. Very important, continuing good faith and diligent effort standard in this contract. If after 45 days or whatever date you put in this blank here, the buyer has not received their loan approval and affirmatively terminated the contingency in writing, the seller may terminate at any time prior to closing, and the buyer gets their deposit back. Very different from the FAR bar, which has a 30-day hard termination. This contract does the finance contingency does not terminate until the buyer in writing affirmatively waives the contingency. Once they waive the contingency, then there's the 10-day window to comply with CFPB rule compliance and to accommodate receipt and execution of the loan package. If after the contingency period is over, the buyer is unable to get, or for whatever reason cannot get financing, then the buyer can terminate, provided they follow one of two rules. Either they provide the seller with an Equal Credit Opportunity Act statement of adverse credit issued by the lender saying that the property or the buyer was unacceptable, or other evidence from the creditor lender that buyer made the loan application and made the diligent and good faith effort to meet all of the requirements, but neither got approved or denied within the 45 days. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about that? I know that that can be very confusing, but I really want to make sure that everybody gets it.
Yeah, Sam, I've got a question on that.
Yeah, Jean.
There's been some extended loan times in underwriting due to either, for some reason, lack of staff or lack of being able to get documents.
Yep.
Does that fall within that, and who has to reply to that?
So what you're asking has two answers, depending on what you mean by get documents. If the buyer is having a hard time getting his documents to the lender because of COVID or whatever other reason, it comes under this good faith and diligent effort standard. The buyer has to have made a diligent and good faith effort to comply with the lender's requirements. So if the buyer gets all the stuff to the lender gets the approval, everything is good to go, we're going to close. But then for whatever reason, the lender is backed up, it's the end of the month, it's a Friday, They can't get the loan organized. They can't get the documents out to the title agent. Then this bold language kicks in here. And if buyer waives this contingency and is unable to close on the closing date due to a delay caused solely by the creditor lender and or necessitated by the CFPB rule, buyer may extend the closing up to 10 days for CFPB rule compliance and to accommodate receipt and execution of the loan package and loan funding. That's the mail away situation. Lender has to mail, or closing agent has to mail the package to the buyer, and the lender can't get the loan package done until the day before closing, but then we're going to go the day after closing because of the mail back. That's what this 10 days is for. Does that answer the question, Jean? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Sam.
Okay. All right. So that's the financing. Let's go to the next. Let's see. You can't see myself there. Can you see the slides? I got to do this again. Hold on. Okay. Okay, I said all this. All right, let's talk about assessments and government liens. So the one quick note, if your property is in a CDD or MSTU, there's another CDD MSTU addendum that you have to fill out and fill in. That's section 5 of the contract. And that addendum is pretty self-explanatory. If there's questions about that, I'll take them separately. But let's talk about association, government liens, and special assessments. Again, vast difference between this and the FARBAR contract. In the NABOR contract, the seller pays any assessment imposed that meets the 3-part test of identity of the lienor, property subject to the assessment, and the amount of the lien assessment that is imposed before the effective date. The FARBAR is before closing. NABOR is before the effective date. So if you've got a long close and you know an assessment is coming down the pipe, you may have an issue. You need to negotiate that. Now, in the NABOR contract, there is this word pending. Very frustrating. The NABOR contract makes it very clear that assessments that meet the 3 criteria are paid by the seller. When does the buyer have to pay the assessment? If there is an assessment that is pending prior to the effective date, that is not disclosed to the, let me put this on Do Not Disturb. If there is a assessment that is pending, that is the seller knows about it in some form or fashion, but it's not official yet. It doesn't meet the 3-part test, but the seller still knows it's coming down the pipe, and he does not disclose that to the buyer, then the seller pays everything over 1% of the purchase price if the assessment is large. If the seller won't do that, then the buyer can terminate. So it gets very complicated in section 6 of the contract with regard to figuring out, is the assessment more than 1% or less than 1%? Has there been proper notice prior to contracting? So the short answer to this is, as the realtor, if you need to know your communities that you're selling in. If you are selling in an association, you got to talk to the president, you got to talk to the management company, you got to know if there's a special assessment coming in the near future, because if it's been in the board minutes, if it's been on the agenda, if it's been discussed by board members at a meeting and it's recorded somewhere, probably counts as pending under the NABOR contract, and the seller has to deal with it prior to closing or prior to contracting. Okay. Leases. If your property is subject to a lease, there is a checkbox in section 7 of the contract, and it's basically the seller has 5 days to deliver the leases. The buyer has 5 days to review. If they don't like the leases, they have they have to terminate within the 5 days, not more than 10 days after contracting. Very simple, not too tough. There's not a lot of stuff about estoppels or things like that with regard to leases in the NABOR contract. Like it's very different from the FAR bar again. Okay, so inspections. Section 8, the buyer has 3 choices. They can pick the full inspections, which I'm going to go into in great detail. They can do a due diligence inspection, in which case we attach the as-is addendum to this contract, effectively making this contract an as-is contract, with the buyer having 15 days to walk for any reason or no reason. Or the buyer can completely waive all inspections and just move to closing as soon as title is ready. Okay, so that's the basics of the top half of, let's call it, of the contract. Now we're going to get into transaction standards. I'm going to go through each of them, and we're going to talk about what each one of them means so that you can effectively explain them to your customer, but there's nothing really in here to modify from the realtor perspective. You just need to kind of understand these things. Okay. Standard A has 3 parts. Marketable title is the first part. Title to the property shall be good and marketable according to the uniform title standards promulgated by the Florida Bar, and have legal access subject to the following exceptions: taxes, zoning, and the condo docs. And the property has to be for residential purposes. The buyer gets marketable title. I hear realtor, like where I'm from, Nebraska, and we say realtor, not realtor in Nebraska, drives Florida realtors crazy when I say realtor. It drives title agents and lawyers crazy when realtors say that the buyer is getting clear title or fee simple title. You're not getting fee title, you're getting marketable title. What is marketable title? There is no lawyer in Florida that can tell you what marketable title is, other than they can tell you it's a title that it can be resold. Every book on my shelf, if I can show this, every book on my shelf says there's no legal definition of marketable title. It's just a title that you can resell. Okay, so now that I've beat that to death, NABOR is very different from FAR bar in regards to assignments. The FAR bar contract, you check a box to determine assignability. In the NABOR contract, it's freely assignable. The buyer can change names at up to 15 days prior to closing. They can give the closing agent the name of the buyer, whatever it's going to be, Bob and Sally Jones, or Bob Jones, or Sally Jones, or Jones and Company, or JJ Jones and Company. But it's freely assignable, so you don't have to. And the other thing is, the current buyer lists on the contract can't get out of the contract or get out of responsibility for the contract. They can simply assign it to their entity, to whoever they want to. And then the other thing is, both the NABOR and the FAR bar, this is true. You do not need to put language in your contract when you're doing a 1031. It's already in there. It's already in the FAR bar, in the NABOR contracts. You don't have to add it to the additional terms. Another cringeworthy moment for your local real estate attorney. Okay, standard B. Oops, how do I get rid of that? Title defects. So another major difference that actually is going to cost your seller money is, in the NABOR contract, the seller has 10 days to deliver the seller's prior title policy. If they don't have it, then they got to give a credit to the buyer of $150. Used to be $300, but we changed that several years ago. And then the buyer has 30 days to examine title and determine legal access. Then the seller has 30 days from the date the buyer gives the seller the title commitment to clear the title. Now, this 30-day date may extend closing. One of the very few times in the NABOR contract when closing can be extended. Financing and title. That's it. If the seller cannot clear title in that 30 days and it's after the closing date, then the buyer has 5 days to terminate or accept title as is. Another major difference. The seller under the NABOR contract has to bring suits and to clear title. They have to spend money. FARBAR doesn't require the seller to spend money, but NABOR does. Big difference, major problem if there's a lot of title defects. Okay, and stop me anytime. Just unmute yourself and shout out your questions. I am happy to be interrupted. Standard C, the survey, coastal construction control line. Seller has 10 days to deliver the survey to the buyer. Buyer has up till 5 days before closing to get their own survey. We do that because we want to get the loan approved before paying for a survey. And then that becomes a title objection if there's a problem. And again, the seller has 30 days to clear survey objections as if they were title objections. And it's a title objection, so it may extend the closing. All right, it's already.
Quick question, Sam.
Yes, you do.
If the, playing devil's advocate, I guess, what if the seller never had a survey done on the property?
Then they don't have to deliver. Then they don't have to deliver it, and the buyer has to get their own survey if they're getting a loan.
Do they have to provide that in writing to the other agent saying we do not have a survey, blah blah blah?
Usually the listing agent will shoot an email over to the closing office and to the selling agent and just say, "Hey, seller doesn't have their survey."
And that's sufficient. Okay.
And that's good. There's no formal notice of no survey.
You know me, I'm always looking for anything that can get people out of contracts. I don't want them to do that.
Well, I will tell you this. In terms of keeping the deal together, I would rather have a NABOR contract. It's very hard to get out of this contract. There's only a couple of little loopholes. This contract is written by NABOR for realtors to keep deals together. We say in the NABOR Legal Resources Committee, we're a trade association for realtors. We got to take care of our customers, but we got to keep deals together. So, okay.
Thank you. All right, I will be quiet now.
No, keep going. I love questions. I will say that I'm behind schedule though, so I'm going to.
Hey Sam, can we jump back to financing for a second?
Sure.
I had a question about the financing. Does that apply to a single application, or is the buyer required to do multiple applications in an attempt to get financing?
That's a very good question. I would argue that since the buyer has to exercise continuing good faith and diligent effort to get approved, if they get denied in the loan period or the lender says, I'm not going to get this done, they have an obligation to go to another lender. But that hasn't been tested in court. It's just my interpretation of the contract as a lay lawyer.
Sounds good.
Okay, leases. Okay, we're at C. Do we do? Yeah, we did that. D. Okay, standard D. Standard D is somewhat famous among NABOR people because it's really long and complicated. So standard D1, we'll break it all down. Standard D1 is the disclosures, the mandatory seller's disclosures, and the advisements and acknowledgements. And let me just resize this on my screen so that I can teach it a little better. Okay.
Okay, real quick question again.
Yeah.
One of our requirements on the listing side at Jones & Company is we have our sellers fill out the seller's property disclosure statement.
Excellent. Do
And
it.
put that up in the MLS. So this contract isn't going to override that.
No. As a matter of fact, we provide one of the NABOR forms is a seller's disclosure form that matches this contract. So if you are going to use the NABOR forms, use all the NABOR forms, because the seller's disclosure on this contract, on this set of forms, I'm going to show you when we get to standard D2B, there's a line that says anything disclosed by the seller prior to contracting and signed off on by the buyer on the disclosure form, the seller doesn't have to repair. So it's actually an out for the seller to get out of repairs to provide the seller disclosure form. I always want my sellers to do a disclosure form. It's required. It's not required by law, but it's required by good by fair dealing. Johnson v. Davis, I'm about to talk about, says no facts, conditions materially affecting the value except those which are readily observable to the buyer. The seller makes that representation in the contract, and we want to follow that because it's a lot of liability for the seller if they don't do it. The standard D1 also said the seller represents there's no known open permits or there are no improvements done without permits. If you know you have open permits, we have an issue and we need to fix the contract up front by disclosing known open permits prior to contracting. This is a big deal. No open permits or improvements done without permits is a representation that can get a seller in a lot of trouble if it turns out they were lying. The other thing that's in the contract is this HOA condo disclosure. Basically, the NABOR form puts it on the buyer to investigate the community so that they know what's going on in the community they're about to buy in. Golf memberships, bundled golf, mandatory association dues, things like that are all on the buyer to determine. Now, the seller still has to provide the HOA disclosure. The seller still has to provide the condo docs, and we're going to talk about that in those sections. But there is a section here in Standard D1 regarding community investigation that says the buyer is advised that any condo or homeowner docs received by the buyer may not include important information about pending foreclosures, types of insurance, budgets, things like that. And the seller designates the buyer as seller's representative for purposes of obtaining that information. Okay. Inspection. Standard D2. Everybody write down the numbers 15, 5, 10, and 5. You have 15 days. It's not a fill in blank. It's a hard date in the NABOR form. 15 days to do inspections in the NABOR contract. Once your 15 days are up as the buyer, you then have 5 days to gather your reports and deliver them to the seller, who then has 10 days to review your reports, make some decisions, and come back to you with either an acceptance, a rejection, or a counteroffer to your buyer's election to either have remedial action or a credit. When the election from the seller comes back as something other than accepted, then the last number 5, the buyer then has 5 days to either proceed as is or terminate. Does everybody understand that? 15 days to inspect, 5 days to deliver reports, 10 days for seller review. If the seller rejects or counters, the buyer has 5 days to terminate. Very simple, but very complicated. Because the buyer may inspect 6 items. The systems and equipment, that's the washer, the dryer, the HVAC, the disposal, the lights, the electrical, the plumbing. They may check for radon, they may check for lead-based paint, which no one really does, and then they may check for wood-destroying organisms, mold, and open permits. Right away, it should leap out to you, difference from the FAR bar. There's no radon and no mold inspection in the FAR bar. And the open permits, the seller has to resolve them as opposed to just give information about them. Okay. So when the buyer does their inspections, they inspect their 6 items. The buyer may request a credit. The credit has to equal the cost of remedial action. It cannot be that they get a new HVAC. If the HVAC is not in working condition, that means that it's not cooling correctly, or that it's leaking, or some other issue. Then the buyer is entitled to an air conditioner in working condition. They're not entitled to a new air conditioner. If the seller doesn't complete the requested repairs, if the buyer chooses remedial action prior to closing, then there's a 200% of the invoiced amount for the remedial action that's held in escrow, and the seller has to complete the repairs after closing. Everybody understand that? Robert, you look perplexed. Everybody got it? Okay. So what's working condition versus cosmetic? Well, your contract, your NABOR contract, has a definition. This is the bottom of standard D2B, lines 298. Systems and equipment shall be deemed to be in working condition if operating in the manner designed to operate. If the air conditioner is supposed to have a 20-degree differential and it only has a 19-degree differential, the air conditioner is not in working condition, and you have it out, and the buyer can get it repaired. If the water heater is rusty and ugly and old, but it works because the water coming out of the faucet is hot, cosmetic, no new water heater. Now, what happens if you're in the condo and the condo has a 10-year life for all water heaters in their rules, and the water heater is 11 years old? I would argue under the NABOR contract that if the water heater is in working condition, you may not have to replace it, depending on what the condo docs say, and depending on what the estoppel from the association says. Very contentious issue, not clearly addressed by the FARBAR or the NABOR contract, probably an area that we need to address at the Legal Resources Committee. Okay, next up, standard D2C, the seller has a maintenance obligation. They must keep the property as is as of the effective date, wear and tear accepted. They have to make the repairs agreed to. If they don't keep the property, or if they don't make the repairs, then again, there's a 200% escrow. Finally, standard D2D, and I'm going through this very quickly. I apologize for that, but I said I'd keep this to an hour. Standard D2D, the walkthrough inspection, the buyer can look for 4 items. Completion of remedial action. They can make sure the items that are being conveyed as part of the contract remain on the property. They can make sure the items that are not being conveyed are removed from the property, and they can make sure that the seller's maintenance obligation that the property has been maintained also. Okay. Standard D2E. Lots going on in standard D2E. This is where we talk about risk of loss. Again, the seller has an obligation even after the hurricane to fix the property up. This includes landscaping, although there's a limitation of 1% for landscaping of the purchase price. So the seller's got to put the trees back. They got to put the bushes back after the hurricane, but they only have to spend 1% of the purchase price to do it. So if you're selling in, what's a really nice part of Lee County? Along the river, and you knock over one of those old banyans or a royal palm and they're irreplaceable, the NABOR contract would not obligate the seller to replace one of them. You know, if you're along McGregor Boulevard there. Okay. If there's no, and I've had this case, so I'm going to talk about insurance and habitability. If the property is uninhabitable or uninsurable, this happened to me after Irma, the buyer can terminate. If you can't get insurance or it's uninhabitable, then the buyer can terminate the contract prior to closing. And then if there is a hurricane, there is another opportunity for a post-casualty inspection. The buyer can come in and they can assure their lender that the property is still there and still standing. Okay. Expenses. Everybody wants to know how much their closing is going to cost. Buyer picks the title company in all counties. In Lee County, the seller pays for title. The seller pays for doc stamps. That's 70 cents per $100 of value. The buyer pays for the doc stamps and the intangibles tax on the note in the mortgage. And the buyer pays for the lien search, which is different than the FAR-bar. Okay. Prorations, this is pretty typical. You prorate the tax and the association dues. One major difference in the FAR-bar, from the FAR-bar, in the NABOR, when you have new construction, not on an old lot like if you do like in Lehigh or in Cape Coral, where they got all those vacant lots and you're building. There, you prorate the taxes based on the value of the lot as of January 1 in the year of closing. But when it's a new lot that was created by a development in the current year and there's no prior year tax bill, but it's a built lot, then you would use 80% of the value of the purchase price, and you would take it against the millage rate, and you figure out what the proration is. You prorate any propane that's in the propane tank. If you've got a generator or just a propane for whatever reason, you would prorate that, and then you prorate rents, and you transfer security deposits. Okay. These are the same because they're state laws, FAR-bar and NABOR. And basically the HOA, 3-day right to void the contract if the HOA disclosure is not provided prior to closing. Remember, there's no documents needed, except in the NABOR forms, there is an HOA addendum where the seller has to deliver HOA documents. I believe in the FAR-bar's addendum B, it already says that the seller has to deliver the documents. Then for condos, there's a 3-day right to void the contract for condo documents, which everybody knows about. If you don't, I can explain that separately. And then now in the NABOR form, don't forget the condo governance form. This is a form, it's in Form Simplicity. It is in zip forms. Attach it to your offer. Make sure that it's signed or seen by the buyer. There's no signature on it. It is a required document in the NABOR contract. Okay, standard J. The buyer has 10 days to make application to the association. If there is no approval received by the closing date, then either the buyer or seller can terminate. The seller has to get the estoppels from the association and deliver them prior to closing. And then this is another place that's different than the FAR-bar. In the NABOR form, if the ground lease on some of these co-ops or some of these condos is less than 40 years, the buyer can terminate. So you gotta, again, you gotta know your community, you gotta know the building or the association that you're selling in, and you gotta make sure that anybody who has a ground lease, that you understand what that means. And obviously you wanna call your closing attorney right away when you see a ground lease.
Can I ask on that, how would, because we've got a lot of newer agents here to Florida, how would they determine whether they're on the selling side or the buying side? How would they determine if there's a ground lease?
2 ways. Call your title agent, have them do a title search, or you can go on the county clerk website and search for the association name, which is a good idea to do anyways.
They know in Orlando, they've even got some single family homes now where they're doing ground leases on the properties.
That's so creepy, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is another big one. So we get to the closing table. The seller is all kinds of agitated. They don't want to sign documents. They're frustrated. They're ready to move on. And the buyer, the title company's putting a bunch of stuff in them from the buyer's lender and saying, sign here, sign here, sign here. And then the seller says, what the hell am I signing? Why do I have to sign this? I'm not the buyer. I'm not involved with the lender, but it's an FHA loan that you agreed to in the NABOR contract. I just copied this line right out of there. If buyer elected to obtain mortgage financing under paragraph 4B, the policies of the lender creditor shall prevail as to the procedures for closing and disbursement of the mortgage loan proceeds, which means seller is going to cooperate or seller is going to be in breach of contract. That's a big difference. Okay, So the escrow agent's that's mostly for us escrow agents in the contract, but the escrow agent is not liable. And if we can do interpleader lawsuits to sue if you guys don't agree on the deposits. FIRPTA is laid out in the contract as well. It's a buyer's obligation. People get confused. They think that the seller has to do FIRPTA. No, FIRPTA is a buyer obligation. 10 days to remit 15% to the IRS after closing unless there's an exemption. And let me tell you about FIRPTA. It applies to every single transaction. Two Americans born and raised in Florida buying and selling property with each other, FIRPTA applies. Why isn't there a withholding? Because there's an exemption for American citizens and you sign a non-foreign certification in your closing documents. If you're a buyer, make sure you get a copy of that in case the IRS comes knocking. Just a tip. And the seller holds the buyer harmless for the FIRPTA amounts. And of course, there's exemptions that may be applicable. And then there's a FIRPTA addendum to the contract that can be signed if the buyer knows that they're going to qualify for the exemption because the property is under 300,000 or under $1 million, and the buyer is going to be the person who uses the property the most of anybody who uses the property within the next 2 years. And I do a whole class on FIRPTA. I could talk about that separately, but just understand FIRPTA applies to every transaction, and when it's a foreign seller, we're going to do a withholding. Okay, so buyer and seller are really excited. They're going to get into the property. They want to get it sold. They want to do it quickly, but they still want to do inspections. They're still getting a loan, and it's still in a condo. There is a hurry up provision in Standard N. It's called the quick closing, and all the deadlines compress to meet the closing timeline. But except the condo and HOA void periods. You can't have a 3-day closing unless the buyer just closes within 3 days and ignores their condo obligations, which I never recommend. Okay, so major difference between the FAR-BAR and the NABOR here. FAR-BAR says that all of the deposits due under the contract are the buyer's punishment for breach. NABOR says only the deposits made, see this word made right here, shall be paid to seller as the liquidated damages, which shall be seller's exclusive remedy. The seller can't sue for damages under the NABOR form, folks. So that's a major difference. You want those deposits in, you want them in on time, and if they're not in on time, you want to terminate the contract because your buyer's a deadbeat. I mean, that's really the only way the NABOR contract treats this. So be very careful about deposits.
So the seller can't sue for specific performance?
The seller cannot sue for specific performance under the NABOR form. That's a big difference. Yes, that's correct.
Wow.
See that? This language on your screen is copied from the contract, which shall be seller's exclusive remedy.
Yeah.
So it's a big difference. You can't force the buyer to buy. Okay. I have 5 minutes and 8 slides. Okay. So litigation attorney's fees. The winning party in the lawsuit gets their attorney's fees paid. This is very bad for your sellers because they've got all the equity. If the seller doesn't perform, I love specific performance. I come in as the buyer, we play the heavy, we force the sale, and the seller pays my fee. So if you're a seller, don't breach the NABOR contract. Notices, disclosures, acknowledgements, and documents. I just want to point out a few things. All notices, disclosures, and acknowledgements must be in writing. The realtors texting back and forth is a writing. Be careful what you text. Be careful what you put in emails. Check with your attorney to make sure that you are, when you're making these representations, you're not obligating your customer to something that they didn't agree to. Okay, this second bullet point, if the realtor receives the document, it counts. If the lawyer receives the document, it counts. Unless you're delivering the condo and HOA docs, then they got to get to the party and they got to be signed off on. And there's a condo co-op document receipt form that you should use and have the buyer sign to acknowledge receipt of the documents. Okay, this is so important. It's in the contract twice. All modifications shall be in writing. Big difference. NABOR deadline for all deadlines is 11:59 p.m. on the date of the deadline. When a deadline ends on a weekend or a holiday, it rolls to the next business day at 11:59 p.m. There is no 5 p.m. deadline in the NABOR contract. Big difference from the FAR bar. So when your inspection period and when you're on the last, for example, on the as-is contract, when you're on the last day of that 15-day inspection period and you don't have a signed amendment after the inspections determining who's going to fix what or what credit is going to be given, you have until 11:59 to terminate. And man, you better terminate if you don't have your buyer's agreement to move forward as is. So pay attention to that deadline. Also in the standard R, all deposits go back to the buyer unless otherwise stated. And then there's a release for the settlement statements to be delivered to all the parties and the realtors. Okay, standard S is the negotiated terms. Where's standard S? Okay. Just says that all the negotiations must be in writing. That's the third time it's mentioned in the contract because it's so important. Buyer's decision is based on buyer's investigation. And here's important for you. The buyer holds the broker harmless from liability or loss caused by seller's failure to disclose. So the buyer is holding you, the realtor, harmless if the seller fails to disclose and the buyer gets hurt. Now, if the seller says something or the listing agent says something to you as the selling agent, and it is a Johnson v. Davis issue, you have an obligation, an absolute legal obligation to tell the buyer about it. If you're the listing agent and the seller tells you something, and you have an obligation to tell the other agent, or if the buyer's not represented, to tell the buyer. So be very careful about that. Okay. Binding contract legal counsel. Each party acknowledges that prior to signing, the closing expenses were explained, the transactions were received, and everybody talked to their lawyer and checked on their title to make sure they knew what they were getting into. And then you, as the realtor, are advising the buyer and seller to consult their attorneys, their accountants, and everybody else. Very important liability protection for the realtor. Okay, other terms and conditions and addenda, not addendu. There is a huge list of addendums that you can put in your contract. And on line 535 to 539, you can list the addenda. There's not a checkbox like the FAR-BAR forms. NABOR has over 80 forms, pre-closing occupancy, post-closing occupancy, all types of stuff. Make sure that you use those forms, because if you write something into the other terms and conditions and you cause a problem for your buyer or your seller, you probably committed the unlicensed practice of law and committed your broker to liability that they otherwise didn't have. So be very, very careful about that. Okay. Last up, before questions, there's a wire fraud advisory right on the contract. Don't share the wire instructions. JJ, should the realtors ever have wire instructions? She's not listening.
She's on the phone, but I will tell you for her, absolutely no. Both her, I, and Janet will all scream at you.
Never handle the wire instructions. Let the buyer, the seller, and the title agents do it between themselves. If you are getting your commission, like in my office, we pay same-day pay to realtors when the broker allows us. Give me your wire instructions, but don't give me your buyer or your seller's wire instructions. I'll get that from the party. Okay. Questions? Anybody? Everyone's on mute.
I think we've learned we have to read the contract and really know what the heck's in a NABOR contract if we're going to use it.
I think that is an excellent suggestion.
We've also talked about, like, in the confidential remarks of the MLSs, if you see that the agent is requesting a NABOR form, you better know the NABOR form if you're going to write it up, or if you're the listing and you don't want to work with NABOR, but use the FAR. Sets the game rules, right?
Yes. Yep. What I would say is each contract is a tool. The FAR has certain provisions that help sellers and buyers. The NABOR has certain provisions that help sellers and buyers. I wouldn't say I'm a FAR user or a NABOR contract guy. I would know both sets of forms and use them as tools. Sometimes you want to go as is. If you're the seller, an as is NABOR FAR contract with the finance contingency is probably better for the seller. It's probably, if I'm the buyer, I want the NABOR as is because of the way the financing contingency works. But then if the inspections are the bigger issue in the deal, I might want the NABOR contract because I, as the buyer, have a nice big list of things that I can inspect and ask the seller to correct, and I can still get out of the contract if the seller refuses. So I don't know, it just depends on the deal. Always be looking for what your customer needs and what's important to your customer.
Mm-hmm.
Other
This
questions?
is great. Thank you. I've learned a couple of new things today.
Yeah, that's
I'm
important.
sure everyone here on the screen has as well. We do keep all of the NABOR forms, all the addendums, contracts, so we're in app files. So you can use them, just don't mix them. Don't use FR with NABOR forms. That's a big freaking mess for us as brokers.
Great advice. Do not mix the forms. The forms all contain references to the main contract that don't match each other. Be very careful about mixing the forms. Don't do that.
Yeah, no excuses for the customer to get out of the contract. Don't do that. All right, well, I know we're running over at 11:04. So thanks. If you guys have any questions, feel free to contact Sam. He does a great job. And we also have an agreement with him that if you're down working with your customers in Naples,
Yeah.
you call their office, make an appointment, and you can use their conference room, fax machine, email, all that good stuff, so that they're our extended Naples office. And Sam comes up and uses our Cape and Fort Myers offices as well.
Yep. So thank you guys very much. If you have any questions, you can call or text me anytime.
Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend.
All right. Take care, y'all.